no doubt that we're living in an ever-changing world, a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected. Technology has progressed to a point where in many circumstances borders only exist on the physical maps that we look at. How do countries and governments remain ahead of these technological advancements and maintain ties with other nations? Well, today I'm honoured to be joined by a true expert in his field. His areas of research include international relations, global security, US foreign policy, great powers, and the Horn of Africa. He's one of the Universities of Otago's inaugural sesquicentennial distinguished chairs. He is the author or editor of 12 books. He's a Fulbright Senior Scholar and an honorary professor of the New Zealand Defence Command and Staff College. He provides regular contributions to the national and international media on global issues and events. Professor Robert Patman, I'm exhausted after reading that introduction. It's a pleasure to have you on. How are you?
Good morning, Sam. Yeah, I often have that effect on people, the Patman cure for insomnia.
So I'm really curious to find out about your career initially. How long have you been involved in teaching, and what actually motivated you to focus on the world of international relations and global security as a profession?
Well, it wasn't a master plan, that's for sure. I didn't sort of grow up with a very clear vision. My initial aspiration in life was to become a professional footballer in the UK, where I was born. That didn't work out, unfortunately, and therefore I had to face up to what many people have to face up to, is getting a job. So to get a job, I had to study. And in that process, I did better than most people expected, and I found myself at university. I then took, after my first degree, after my first degree, I did a master's degree. Then I took a break, and then I did a PhD after working in the City of London. And eventually I became, after my PhD, then worked for 2 more years in the corporate world, and then got a job at the University of Surrey. And I was just 6 months into that job before I got a very nice offer from the University of Otago. I was then very young and sounded like a fabulous adventure. So I came to Otago, and I've never regretted it. I love New Zealand. It's a lovely country. And the funny thing is, and it sounds corny, but it's absolutely true. I arrived in New Zealand 30 years ago with no apparent connections to the country. And I felt more comfortable in New Zealand within 24 hours than the country I've been born in, which was a very strange thing, to travel all that way and yet feel that level of comfort and identification with the people here. So, yeah, I mean, it was, my love affair of New Zealand's gone on ever since. I mean, I wouldn't live anywhere else. So much as I enjoy traveling, of course, but I'm always keen to come back.
Yeah, you're definitely probably the standout professor in during my time at Otago, studying politics. I really enjoyed your class. I think it was probably 2017 now. So there's a few areas of interest that I'd like to get into today. However, the first is quite pressing, and it concerns the most recent events in Afghanistan, with reports that the Taliban have now marched into Kabul. I'd like to get your initial thoughts and reaction on this.
Well, I'm demoralized like many other people. For all its faults, the international presence led by the United States, which has been there since overthrowing the Taliban in 2001, has changed, I think, for the better, Afghan society in many respects. Girls now have opportunities which were denied them, and particularly in education, when the Taliban were previously in power. I mean, the Taliban was an incredibly brutal regime, the so-called Islamic Emirate, which again they've declared after seizing Kabul. They said they've got an Islamic Emirate in place. And also the 20-year international presence created opportunities for women to get employment opportunities which were previously denied them. And we also shouldn't overlook the fact that while the Afghan government's army has not performed well, apparently given no solid resistance to the Taliban, and the president has ignominiously fled from the capital instead of standing his ground, we can't overlook the fact that the Taliban's military triumph has overthrown a democratically elected government. So I think it's bad news on many fronts. It's bad news on the international human rights front, and it's bad news for the global security front, because the Taliban is in alliance with groups like Al-Qaeda, and it is also reported Islamic State. And these apparently were reported as helping in the recent military campaigns. So we can expect that a Taliban-led government will once again host groups that engage in international terrorism, which is bad news. And I think, yeah, it's the other thing we have to take into account here. There is quite a bit of backlash now against not just the Biden administration in the United States, but there's also a growing concern to what extent were Pakistan security services aiding and abetting the Taliban in this recent offensive. Pakistan has a long time association, their intelligence services, with the Taliban. So that's another worry. And there's also the prospect of regional upheavals, because the Taliban in Pakistan may well see the triumph of the Taliban in Afghanistan as the green light for them to seize power or try to seize power there. And we are talking about a country with nuclear weapons when we talk about Pakistan. So there's some worrying implications here.
How does an international involvement that spans the better part of 20 years so abruptly come to an end within the space of a week or two? How does this happen so fast?
Well, I don't think it's happened quite in a week or two. In many respects, if you want to look at the resurgence of the Taliban, you have to look back, I think, Sam, to the decision of 2003, when the Bush administration decided to invade Iraq. They directly transferred troops from Afghanistan to Iraq, and they were totally preoccupied with Iraq. Now, at that stage, the Taliban were on the ropes in 2003. They'd been overthrown and largely dispersed, but they were able to regroup. These Taliban fighters are very dedicated. They have a very, if you like, fundamentalist understanding of Islam, which is pretty intolerant, by the way, if you're not a believer. And they have regrouped. But in a sense, the United States, I think, got distracted by going after a country or a regime, the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. Instead of consolidating democratic rule or helping to consolidate democratic rule in partnership with the UN in Afghanistan, the Taliban by 2006 had regrouped and had become a potent fighting force again. So there were some mistakes made there on the tactical level. Nevertheless, your question is a good one. I mean, the United States has pumped in more than $80 billion. And there's been NATO, there have been other Western countries, not just the United States on its own. And yet still, despite training a force of 300,000 plus, that force wasn't able to stand up to 80,000, probably less well-equipped fighters, but more motivated fighters. And yeah, I mean, you literally, I think there's a number of factors involved in the collapse of the Afghan state army. One is the high level of corruption in Afghanistan. There were reports just a few weeks ago, which were credible, that Afghan state troops were not getting enough food. They were not getting basic support. Some were selling weapons to get food. This is, these are basic things which need to be taken care of. And I also was struck, I think, by, like many observers, watching the now departed president of Afghanistan give a speech in the last 24 hours, just before he fled the power, where he didn't acknowledge the reverses that occurred. And it was almost like he was operating in a parallel universe. And he's now said that he had to flee the country to avoid bloodshed. But you think to yourself, well, is that true? If the Taliban want to carry out bloodshed, now they've got complete control of the country, they will carry it out. And so, yeah, I mean, I think on balance, the United States has been prepared to have 28,000 troops in South Korea for decade after decade because of the threat of North Korea. And it's also maintained 40,000 or so troops in Germany permanently. You didn't even need a troop presence of that level to keep the Taliban at bay. And I think that's something that there'll be some hard thinking about. I've noticed that some military commentators in the United States are saying that the United States can't necessarily accept this reversal. We'll just have to see. You're in the United States at the moment. You'll have a sense of some of the debates going on there. It'll be an interesting one to watch. But I do think the Trump administration made, and in a sense, the Biden administration has compounded the error, an error when they signaled in negotiations with the Taliban that they saw an end to the American presence. I mean, you don't sort of start a negotiation by saying you're getting out, because what's the point of having a negotiation? What incentive was there for the Taliban to negotiate seriously? And this point was made, recently with regard to the Biden administration. Once the Biden administration signaled that it was getting out come what may, then the Taliban thought, well, we don't need to negotiate because the country's going to be ours anyway. So there's been some long-term factors and there's been some short-term factors, which has created this nightmare situation. It's a huge setback for international human rights. It's a huge setback for global security.
Who masterminded this withdrawal of the troops? Was it planned across successive administrations in the US, and was it solely done for political purposes?
I think Joe Biden, to be fair, who knows a lot about foreign policy, has and got great experience. He, first of all, opposed Mr. Obama's troop surge back in 2009 when Mr. Obama put an extra 30,000 troops into Afghanistan, because Mr. Obama always saw Afghanistan, not Iraq, Afghanistan as the center of the struggle against what he called extremist violence, or violent extremists, I should say. Mr. Biden was not keen on that. He thought, and he said this in 2019, that American presence in Afghanistan was only there to prevent a revival of Al-Qaeda. And I think, in a sense, his decision to, if you like, build on Mr. Trump's initiative to effectively get out of Afghanistan. I mean, the irony is that these two people who are so different on so many issues actually shared a level of discomfort about the American presence in Afghanistan. And I think that Biden had always been skeptical about the American presence in Afghanistan on a long-term basis. And I think when he became president, we saw that. And he gave the green light to getting out of America as soon as possible. Now, to be fair, I think he underestimated, or rather he got intelligence that underestimated the speed of the collapse. I think you'll be aware of this, Sam. A lot of American media networks are now replaying his statement about a week ago, I believe, when he said there's no way that the country is going to collapse in the near future. And of course, this must be a bitter experience for the White House team. But having said all that, he was getting plenty of good advice from intelligence people and from the military that the Afghan army, the state army, would be pretty weak without the American backbone behind it.
What do you now believe, as scary as it may be, is the short to medium term future for the Afghani citizens and Afghanistan as a nation, should global powers be greatly concerned?
Yes, I think, let's be quite clear. If you live in a liberal democracy where human rights are important and tolerance is important and peaceful transfer is important, you cannot be indifferent to what's likely to happen in Afghanistan in the near future. We already know, according to the UN, that we're facing a humanitarian tragedy and disaster on a huge scale. the hundreds of thousands of people are absolutely terrified with the the Taliban coming to power. Not just those people who cooperated with the international presence, but, and I'm talking here about translators and interpreters and other people who worked with the international presence, but we're talking about many people, particularly women, who could lose their employment. An example for it, I was reading just before we began this podcast, a woman who is a widow with 7 children, who is a cleaner in Kabul. And she said with the Taliban coming in, they won't let her work. So how does she provide for her children? Then she will have to become a beggar, because that's the only form of revenue generation that's allowed by the Taliban. And so and by the way, it's not going to be a tea party for the Taliban. Afghanistan is a completely different society to the one that they had in 2001. They committed a whole series of horrendous human rights atrocities between 96 and 2001. We've also had reports in the recent conflict before they seized Kabul, they've committed more human rights atrocities, war crimes. So I'm skeptical that they're going to change dramatically in power. They've already declared what they call an Islamic Emirate. They said they want a peaceful resolution. They want peaceful acceptance, but they have overthrown, whatever its flaws, the previous government was democratically elected. So there's going to be a lot of angry people and frightened people in Afghanistan. To answer your question, I think we run the risk of renewed conflict within Afghanistan. Clearly, some of the people who really oppose the Taliban, some Afghans see this as a return to a dark age, and they may well be tempted, particularly the younger ones, to get organized and physically resist. So, yeah, I mean, it's a potentially explosive situation. And yeah, I don't think the rest of the world, particularly the liberal democratic world, can be indifferent to what's happening.
What was deemed to be the initial criteria of success for the international occupation, or the US occupation of Afghanistan? And do you believe that this was met or fulfilled by the time that they've withdrawn troops?
As I recall it, the Bush administration, when it led it was literally a multilateral operation led by the United States, authorized by the UN. As I recall it, the initial objectives were to decimate Al-Qaeda's camps in Afghanistan and effectively remove the Taliban from power, because the Taliban had refused to hand over the leaders of Al-Qaeda to the United States after 9/11. And the Americans warned them that if they didn't hand them over, they would share the fate of the Al-Qaeda leadership. And when they didn't hand them over, the Americans used the authority granted to them by the UN to take that action. So initially, the operation seemed to be a substantial success. The Taliban were overthrown. Al-Qaeda's camps were largely destroyed. Unfortunately, a lot of the Al-Qaeda people and their Taliban supporters escaped into the tribal lands across the border in northwest Pakistan, an area which was not really governed by the Pakistan government. So they regrouped, and over time, they gained strength for reasons we mentioned.
From one crisis to another, it seems. Let's move on to COVID-19, and I'd like to get some of your initial thoughts about what's happening on a global level with this. What vulnerabilities do you believe that the pandemic exposed on a global level? It could be like a lack of a response plan, a lack of access to healthcare, especially in developing countries. What are your thoughts on these vulnerabilities?
Well, COVID-19 has been what social scientists call a disruptive event. And I don't think the world will not return to the pre-COVID era. COVID-19 is one of a multiplying number of problems which doesn't respect borders. And it's a really challenging event for the way international relations is organized, because for a long time, state sovereignty has been seen as paramount, and many countries base their foreign policy along the lines of their sovereign interests and how to represent them. And in a sense, COVID-19 is a reminder that there are problems such as this global pandemic, which do not recognize borders. And as the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has said, with COVID-19, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So this is very challenging. One thing that really strikes me about COVID-19 was, first of all, there was little leadership shown by the superpowers. Neither China nor the United States came out with a great deal of credit from COVID-19. Neither made a concerted attempt to rally the world in a concerted approach. And clearly, to deal with this problem, you need cooperation. For the reasons we've gone through, it's not possible to unilaterally solve it. One of the things that really struck me, there's two ways of interpreting COVID-19. There is a school of thought which believes that with the lockdowns that so many countries have been forced to adopt, we are seeing the return of nationalism, the demise of globalization. There's another school of thought that says quite the opposite. Globalization is intensifying because most businesses and many educational facilities people have worked online to keep things going, and that has deepened the digital revolution we're living through. So there is that school of thought which says, actually, COVID-19 has accelerated globalization, not diminished it. And there'll be no sort of return to the pre-globalization era. Of those two perspectives, my own view is, Sam, that the latter one, that COVID-19 has accelerated globalization, is probably more, is more credible. And I think myself that it has sensitized many people because of COVID-19 to the fact that we've been neglecting another problem, which is climate change, which is even more dangerous, and like COVID-19, doesn't recognize borders. We've had this problem for 30 years plus. And this week, of course, the IPCC have produced a very damning report saying that we've only probably got a window of 5, maybe 7 years to come up with effective international action to deal with climate change, to try and arrest it, or at least get it moving in a downward direction. So we're probably living in a time which is both scary but fascinating. We're looking at nothing short of a major energy paradigm shift in order to deal with this problem. So, yeah, I mean, there's not, in my view, COVID-19 has signaled a new era in global politics. I don't think there's going to be any return to the pre-COVID era. And if we don't adapt, one thing that was really striking to me is that those countries with populist leaders, which stress the virtues of nationalism and a compartmentalized view of the world, the view that states run the world, they have performed very badly in relation to COVID-19. The Trump administration, over 600,000 people in the United States unfortunately died. Johnson administration Johnson government in the UK, more than 150,000 have died. And Bolsonaro in Brazil, all these leaders were very slow to react to the problem, were dismissive of it, and then belatedly tried to lock down when it was too late. And countries like Britain have done quite well on the vaccination front, and now the United States has shown real momentum on the vaccination front since Biden's been in power, or even just before, actually. But nevertheless, lots of people have lost their lives because their governments were not particularly responsive to a problem which doesn't recognize borders. And let's be quite clear, there are a number of leaders in power at the moment which do not take science and public healthcare expertise seriously. And thankfully in New Zealand, and without being smug or self-congratulatory, fortunately, maybe it's because it's a relatively small population of 5 million people, the healthcare professionals and the scientists have had really positive and constructive influence on the government.
I completely agree with those points, especially the ones that you make about New Zealand's response. And in light of your earlier points around the more populist and nationalistic leaders, such as Trump in America and Johnson in the UK, I'd like to get your thoughts on this statement. I was reading an interview today by renowned historian Professor Neil Ferguson. When discussing America's response and subsequent failure to respond sufficiently to COVID-19, that the problem did not initiate from the top down. Whilst acknowledging that populist leaders did make some mistakes, the real problem was found in the mid-level governance response. For example, the Centre for Disease Control, the CDC, completely screwed up testing, not only preventing other people from producing tests, but producing a test itself that didn't work. The second example was, there was no attempt at all to implement contact tracing in the US. And lastly, for the most part, they left elderly exposed at care homes. There was a failure at the regional and the local level as well. Do you agree with his summary of America's response?
No, I don't. With all due respect to Professor Niall Ferguson, who's a brilliant scholar, but with very distinctive right of centre views, I don't agree. I think those governments that we mentioned, the Trump administration was warned by US intelligence at the end of November 2019 that a cataclysmic event was on its way from Wuhan. The Trump administration spent January and February reassuring the American people there was nothing to be worried about. And Mr. Trump actually congratulated and praised China's handling of the problem initially. But by March, it was clear that the problem was affecting the United States, and the Trump administration, by the 17th of March, belatedly responded and started to take measures. But, this was an administration, even in April 2020, was claiming it was analogous to the flu and that people should keep calm, and American exceptionalism, American character would see through this. It would never be defeated by a virus. But the reason I mention this is that I don't think it's fair that, of course, those mistakes that Professor Ferguson alluded to happened, but the biggest mistakes were made by those who have the responsibility for running countries. Let's not just pick on Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump was incredibly slow to come to terms with the seriousness of this situation. I don't think there's, and that is, leaders do send signals. If he reacted when he got that information from US intelligence, he had plenty of time to take really strong and proactive measures. And if he'd taken those measures, I said to the American people in January 2020, this is a really serious threat. We need to take quite intrusive measures, possible lockdowns, wearing a mask. He mocked people who wore masks. The Johnson government was also extremely lax. Mr. Johnson didn't attend the first 5 government of emergency meetings held by his government, which were devoted to this question. It was only on the 6th meeting of the meetings arranged to deal with COVID-19 that Mr. Johnson attended. So, and Bolsonaro again, very, very skeptical about COVID-19. Those attitudes, I think, created an environment which meant that middle-level administrations made mistakes, but also they didn't get a clear message from the top. We mentioned New Zealand, and both you and I have obviously a close attachment to New Zealand, but whatever its faults, the New Zealand government had a very clear message from the beginning. And, this was a very deadly virus. And by and large, most New Zealanders took that clear message and acted accordingly. I was really impressed by how conscientious people have been with respect to the lockdown. And so I don't really accept what Professor Ferguson is saying. It lets the populist leaders off the hook when they failed their people. The problem for populist leaders is that they basically promise the unachievable. And when they're in power and they have to deal with the realities of the world, COVID-19 doesn't respond to their political rules of the game. And that's the big problem.
Yeah, you make some very convincing and sound points there. I completely agree with you in those points. Lucky last question. You mentioned earlier the likelihood that we're going to see more of an acceleration towards globalization. Should New Zealand be looking at other countries' strategies when it comes to reopening the border? And are you worried that the current government seems quite content in keeping the borders controlled the way that they are, the risks to businesses and the likes? Or do you think that this is too much of a political risk to start reopening borders?
I think the New Zealand government, none of us have a crystal ball, but my sense is that it's going to be measured, it's going to be carefully calibrated, that we'll be opening up with societies whose health measures we're confident in. And unfortunately, as you probably know, our attempt to build an air bridge or bubble with Australia has been effectively forestalled because of the Delta outbreak. The biggest problem with COVID-19, which is a lesson for the future, is that we desperately need a global health authority which has credibility and clout. Because at the moment, the developed countries have done wonderfully well to get vaccines out, but there are many countries in the world that don't have a comparable health structure or infrastructure, I should say. And, there have been generous acts by some developed countries which have made the United States has been quite generous in providing additional vaccines for other countries. But we really need to come up with a response to this problem. It's a global problem. We need a global response. But the way of organizing international relations has always been along the lines of nation states. So we're in a bit of a transition at the moment. We've probably been in a transition since the end of the Cold War. I think COVID-19 is, if you like, giving the transition a bit of a new twist. We desperately need institutions which are more effective than the ones we have. The UN Security Council, of course, has been paralyzed by things like the veto. 5 countries have a privilege that no other countries of the UN have, which is a 2-tier membership. There's the elite membership of the 5 and the rest. I don't really think that's a credible way to have an institution at the international level dealing with problems that don't respect any boundaries. So yeah, we're facing a period of reckoning, but to be, I think there's a couple of things that really need to happen, Sam, if we're going to look towards a brighter future. I think globalization, I think we've seen nothing yet in terms of the changes. The reason I say that is that globalization is a structural change. It's not, a lot of populist leaders like Mr. Trump and Johnson and Bolsonaro, they allude to reversing globalization because they assume that globalization is a project. But if you interpret globalization as a structural change that is fueled by changes in digital and communications technology, it's beyond the ability. You can no more deglobalize than you can deindustrialize. The genie's out of the bottle. The question is, how can we make globalization work better for more people? That's the real challenge. And on that front, I'm quite optimistic because I had the great privilege of teaching lots of young people. And I think they've got the passion and the ability to take a less than, take a broader view of the problems. And if you look at it, many of our problems at the moment is that we have many leaders in the world, Xi Jinping, Mr. Putin, until recently, Mr. Trump, who sees international relations as a process of point scoring, a zero-sum game, where there's winners and losers. But as our conversation indicates, most of the key problems states now face, they can only be solved through cooperation, whether it be COVID-19, whether it be climate change, whether it be international terrorism, whether it be the global economy. All these problems require much more cooperation. And one point I'd like to leave you with is that I think great powers, the role of great powers is changing in the 21st century. They are more vulnerable and less able to impose their will than before, which means there's an opportunity for the smaller and middle powers to step up. It's up to them to take that opportunity. And, there's one precedent here which may be promising, and that was the Christchurch call. That was the initiative between New Zealand, a small power, and France, a middle power, an attempt to curb online extremism after the Christchurch terror atrocity. The reason I think that's a promising initiative is because, first of all, the Trump administration rejected it, but 55 other countries said, no, we think that's a good idea. And then the Biden administration signed up to it. I think that the silent majority, those members of the international community who have not got the privilege of veto, and they are the majority, have to step up to the plate now, because these problems can't be solved by great powers. If they could, they would, but they cannot. So it's incumbent on the rest to have their say and shape it.
Well, there's dozens of topics that I'd love to be discussing with you, that I could be here for hours, but it calls for another day and another time. And
Pleasure.
how can viewers and listeners go about finding some of your work online?
Well, I have a YouTube channel, and like many people, I'm on Twitter, but I tend to just use that in a measured fashion, because otherwise you can get into lots of debates with people, which is great if you've got the time. I'm pretty busy, but no, I make contributions to the media, and I try to do bits and pieces on the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel has most of my media pieces on it, and I love interacting with people, and that's how I try to make a contribution. And of course, as you mentioned in the opening remarks, I do write books and things. So I'm doing one at the moment called Rethinking the Global Impact of 9/11. And given the events in Afghanistan in the last few days, there's a certain symmetry, isn't there, Sam? Because 9/11, shortly after 9/11, the Taliban were overthrown, and then 20 years later, almost to the day, short of a month, we're very close to it anyway. We're seeing the Taliban come back, which is, an interesting coincidence.
Brilliant. Well, Professor Robert Patman, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.